This is Talks with Petri, and today we have as our guest Amir Nashat. Welcome.
Thank you, Petri. Thanks for having me.
So great to have you.
Great to see you.
It sounded like you become a VC as an accident. How can that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm old enough that most people that became VCs in my generation was almost always by accident. I started out as a scientist actually, and was working in a laboratory in biomedical and bioengineering. And over the course of my research, I ended up working with a number of people who were starting companies and spinning them out. And then I, was a student, in Massachusetts, in Boston, and there was this group of people that had like funded this company, and I needed a job really badly because I was finishing my PhD. So my office mate, who was the founder of the company, said, "Well, why don't you just come work at our company?" But I had to interview with these people, and they had offices in a place I needed to like borrow my friend's car, and there was like no transportation. It was like a total hassle. Ended up meeting these people, and they were all really nice, but I didn't know what they did. They kept saying, "Oh, we're venture capitalists," but I had no idea what a venture capitalist was. But they were very interesting. One of my partners in the early days had written the protocol for Ethernet, and so he had founded a company called 3Com, and his name's Bob Metcalf. Really wonderful. I got to meet the guy who wrote the Ethernet protocol, and then I met another person who was there at the very, very early days of Lotus, and actually told me this interesting story when I was interviewing. I didn't even know I was interviewing. I was just having these conversations with people around different things.
So you were still a student at the time, or?
I was finishing. PhDs don't end with a bang; they kind of end with like a clatter. It's like a bunch of stuff that falls on the floor. And so it takes you a while from like when you finish to like finishing papers and closing all the experiments and then transferring the experiments to the next generation student that picks up the projects. And so during that kind of interim period, I was supposed to be working at this startup. And then what happened was after, I don't know, probably 15, 20, meetings with different people, maybe less, it felt like it, maybe 10 meetings. I finally turned to my friends and said, I need a job. Like, are we getting a job or not? I don't understand why I have to keep driving out there and meet new people. And what they told me was like, well, the venture capitalists actually would prefer you go work for them, helping them with new companies and things that they were working on. And it turned out that they were just the company that I was going to go work at had already been established. But the firm Polaris was just starting a second company in a new area, and they needed some support for that. So I ended up going at the VC firm, but working on a project which was hatched with a number of really very, very exceptional scientists in the Massachusetts area and in Germany as well, actually. And then a few people at Polaris and other VC firms kind of came together, and we started this company called Alnylam, which has gone on to be a very, very important company in the pharmaceutical, or I would say biotech space. I think there are 4 medicines on the market now. And that was like the first project I worked on. And it kind of showed me this world, which is not strictly venture capital. It's more kind of company creation. You're kind of helping found the companies at the same time that you're helping with all bring the investment together, et cetera. And then you're also an investor. So it's this very hybrid. This was now 2002. And Polaris.
Nowadays they're called more like Y Combinators or incubators, but this was common. Something else.
Now it's common. Back then, I think we were the only venture firm I knew of that was doing that kind of work. Ourselves and the other firm we were working with, Cardinal Partners. Polaris had started a number of companies with those groups. Actually, my partners had started another company before that called Akamai, which went on to become a very important company.
Yeah, it's very famous.
So two of my partners in the office basically helped. One of my partners, George Conrades at the time, he was a venture partner at Polaris. He was the founding CEO, and again, these companies get kind of created in this strange intersection of early stage venture capitalists and people with ideas. So it's it can be a very, very exciting, very collaborative, and kind of a blurry line. Of course, there's other companies that we've invested in where, there's a team and there's a CEO and there's a whole management team. And that's more of a traditional investing role. I think if you're going to work at the very early stage, you have to be a little bit more flexible to sometimes, roll up your sleeves and be a founder or a CEO or, a co-founder or something, and be willing to take that kind of responsibility on also. So it's, my firm, we do a wide variety of things, and I've been lucky to be in a wide variety of projects.
So did you actually work in your first company basically as
I think early
sort of
on,
in the
no, I
day to
never
day,
did.
or
Actually, I never ended up going to that company. It was a company called Momenta Pharmaceuticals, which ended up launching a medicine. I think it may have been the fastest medicine to get to $1 billion in sales or something like that. It had a certain distinction when it launched its medicine. So it was a very important company. It was recently acquired by another pharmaceutical firm, but um, I ended up never working there. I've been on the kind of startup team for a few of the other investments we've made, and in some cases was kind of instrumental in coming up with the idea and pulling everybody together. So yeah.
you mentioned somewhere that you've been lucky to meet and work with really exceptional people. Can you elaborate a bit and something,
Yeah.
how do you find these good people and good opportunities as well? Is there a secret formula for it, or is it like being the right place, like, MIT and
Well, it certainly helps. I mean, I think that each of us has like a process, whatever that, I've always said to people, sometimes people will come by asking for advice on career changes, or you can tell that they're looking for jobs, but they're at this pivot point in their careers, either from science to business or from science to investments or whatever, and or from the company side to the venture side or the investment side. And what I always try to ask people is to figure out like what is your process for making decisions, right? And it trying to understand how you made the key decisions in your life, and what was the driver that made you choose, let's say, the university you went to, if you had a number of choices, or once you were done with university, how you chose which job you took, which firm you went to, or which career path, even decisions around friends or whatever, significant others. I think that when you figure out what your process is, and then you can then you have to ask the second question, which is, has that worked for me, or has that not worked for me? Like, am I generally really happy with all the decisions I made, or has everything always turned out like backwards? And I call it the George Costanza rule from Seinfeld, which was, he was a character on the show, and he realized that his decisions were terrible, so he, for a period of time, decided to do the opposite of everything that came to his mind, and he ended up becoming like wildly successful for a certain number of episodes. I don't remember how long. And so I always feel like, if you think things have gone well, you just keep doing what you've been doing. If you think things are going poorly, you try to reverse it. But the trick is to figure out what is your process, and for me, as I've done that, my process has always been, weirdly, to not have a predetermined goal or notion. So I don't have goals. I don't have this idea that, oh, I want to be X, or I want to be Y, I want to be a professor, etc. I just found myself always willing to kind of work with people I found really curious and interesting and smarter than me, and like had like what, just I could tell I was going to learn a lot being around them, whether that was my friends or whether that was professors I chose to work with. They were just interesting people that, by my definition, I mean, everybody thinks, but they tended to have a broad range of interests, and they tended to be more than just technical. I mean, again, my background is a technical background. I was an engineer, and they tended to have a very strong social side in the cup, but they were also very technically proficient. And somehow I just knew that they were very curious about things outside of the discipline that they were in. And so I was always intrigued by that. And that's kind of how I've made decisions. And so if you look at the companies I've been involved in, they've tended to have, for either even choosing to come to Polaris, where I work now, I'm a partner at the firm. What attracted me to Polaris was that I was meeting the guy. I thought I was talking to a bunch of biotech investors, but I was meeting the person who wrote the protocol for Ethernet. I was meeting the person who was telling me stories about the early days of tech and biotech. I was meeting, my partner, George Conrades, his venture partner then, who was one of the first people at IBM. I mean, he joined IBM in, I think, the 60s. I mean, like really the go time of IBM, and so it was just amazing stories I was hearing. And I just could tell this was a very diverse group and that I was going to have a lot of fun. And then the details would be worked out later. And that tends to be the way I decide on whether what to be involved in or what to do is, I just find interesting people that tell me something I didn't know about before. And I'm like, wow, that's kind of cool. And then I figured it would just be fun hanging out with them. I think there's probably a lot more process to it. Usually, there's an idea they have. The idea has, a certain opportunity around it and all that. So I think in their minds, it's more structured. But if I really dig down, I would say that I'm attracted to people, and that's how I tend to make the decisions I make. But I don't know. But everyone has their own process, so that's kind of how I've done it. In terms of your question of how do I meet people, I'm just extremely. I just found my family makes fun of me because I really am just curious about people, and I'm just really curious. And so when someone's I have no problem engaging with almost anybody around a subject that like they'll tell me, oh, like I'll meet someone and they'll be, you'll quickly discover that they're very, very good at some particular thing like fishing or something. And I just want to know more about it. Like, how did they learn, what did they learn from their grandfather, their father, their mother? Like, how did they, and, I think just being curious about what makes people tick has landed me into places with just cool people, and I think a lot of people are cool if you just take the time to get to know them. I think other people tend to try to meet people that are of influence, like influential people, like they try to kind of, and I don't know, that hasn't really worked for me. I mean, my approach has been more to find curiosity inside anybody, and that's always led me to interesting situations.
So how does it work with new deals, for the VC company as well? Do you, because first time founders, they don't have, they don't tend to have the track record already, so you have to find them somewhere. And is it a curiosity? Do you pick them from the university, or how does it work?
Yeah, I think that I if you were to be very, very honest about the investments I've made or the projects I've worked on or helped co-found, it's always been usually a combination of people who are very experienced at biotech or have started companies before as academics or university professors, et cetera, and someone new, someone younger that they've kind of connected with. And it's that combination of the two that so I think that I tend to kind of find that for me, if you just look at my companies, they tend to be kind of someone who's experienced plus someone who's less experienced, or a first time person. And that thread is true in almost everything I've done. I'm not sure that's a formula I'm following. It just happens to be the way. I think it's just like what I end up kind of spending my time on. Some of my partners, they prefer people who are extremely new, just brand new to entrepreneurship. It's their first company. I have some other partners who will only work with people who've been they themselves have worked with before. So it's like this idea of like, I'm going to work with people over and over again. So we're kind of a broad range. I'm like a bit of a hybrid. Others are a little bit more one direction versus another, but I do think that in general, if you're an entrepreneur trying to make your way, especially if you're a new entrepreneur, you really do need to find, I think it's always helpful if you can co-found or find someone who's been successful before, just because their connections, they just know a lot of people because that experience took them to a lot of different VC firms as they were raising money. Sometimes they heard yes, sometimes they heard no, but they met a lot of VCs. They may have met a lot of big companies. They have a lot of people that they worked with in those companies. I just think the network is so strong for people that have been experienced. And so if I was a first time entrepreneur, I think the best thing to do is find someone who you trust, who you know is going to be a good partner, and you don't mind sharing some of your idea with, and obviously some of the economics. But with someone who has a lot of some experience, and is willing and is a good mentor, would be a good partner, a good coach. I think that helps a lot. It makes things a lot faster, actually, because trying to do everything yourself from scratch is just hard. Relationships take time to build. A lot of people that I work with, I've known for 15 years. So in 3 minutes, we have a level of comfort that took, years to develop, and for a first-time entrepreneur, it just takes time to build those things. And so I just think it goes faster if you can partner up with people that have been experienced. Like you and I were, got to know each other through a project, and I would say quite a lot of the people involved in that know at least one other person for a long period of time, so it's not that everybody knows everybody, but it's that, one person knows one person for a very long time, and then that person knows someone else for a very long time, and then they get into, so there's this trust factor that has created a very strong bond between everybody. Because usually a friend of a friend is a friend kind of concept. So yeah, I think that's a mistake I've seen a lot of young entrepreneurs make, is that they just want to do it themselves. And I don't think anything ever gets done by yourself. I don't know. I don't know of any good company or any great idea that germinated all by one person and they dominated the idea all the way through. It just takes a village to build these things.
Yeah, it's also if you have a transactional nature with building and with relationship, I don't think it gets you too far either, because people will remember. And it's we had with that project, we had a meeting just a few days ago, and it was such a fun to just have and talk with people, and it's because, at least from my side, I felt that because people knew each other, some of them for a long time, and it was like a good chemistry between people, and it was just basically a pleasure to be there and enjoy, and that's a good part of sort of building relationship and having great people around you, and getting to know more of the awesome people. But it certainly takes time.
Yeah, I agree.
You've been building companies in different parts of the world as well, US, Germany, Singapore, and obviously in the US as well. So are there any differences?
Yeah, I think there's definitely difference. Even in the US, there's a big difference. There used to be a big difference between San Francisco and Boston. There still kind of is, more in flavor. Boston's probably more of a biotech heavy environment, where San Francisco still, I think, tech still kind of dominates, and that changes the nature of the entrepreneurs. It changes, somewhat the nature of the investors. New York is a very different kind of environment, and so, and then we started a company in Iceland, which was before my time. I kind of caught the tail end of it. Very interesting company as well, that sequenced all the genomes of all the people in Iceland to create, a data set that would help the company create new medicines and be a benefit to the people of Iceland. We've started some companies in Ireland. We used to have an office there in Dublin, and that was a very different environment too. Germany, I was CEO of a company where most recently, I stepped down about a year ago. And we had about 60 people in the US and about 30 people in Dresden, Germany. And I'm starting up something new that'll probably have a small contingent of people initially in either Berlin or Dresden also. And then I've started a company years ago in Hong Kong. It was kind of fun. That was kind of interesting. And then more recently, a company I'm starting will have a unit in Singapore as well. And I think, what you find is that I think that there's just really, really different views people have about risk and about greed, I guess. And I think that those tend to affect people's views, like when I had this company in Dresden, I was a CEO. We started with him. Actually, interestingly, we had more employees initially in Dresden because they had come from the Max Planck Institute in Dresden. We had recruited about 8 young scientists, maybe 6 or 8 young scientists. So very quickly, we were kind of bigger in Dresden than we were in Boston. Eventually, Boston grew to be bigger. But So I went over and, we were also separate. This was pre-pandemic, but we were using Zoom constantly and we were videoing all the time and things because of the distance. So I went to Dresden first time I visited and put the whole team together. And what we did was, I basically asked the team to write on the board all the prejudices that they had about Americans, like all the stereotypes, just all the worst ideas you've got, all the stereotypes, write them on the board. And, they were obviously not willing to do that. So I was like, well, I'll go first. I'll write all the ones about Germans, that I know, I can think of. And I have actually cousins, my uncle lived in Berlin, still lives in Berlin. So I have cousins that were born in Germany, grew up there. So I've been there many, many times. And, I threw up the usual ones. Stubborn, like don't change your minds, like, slow, cautious, I put all these up. And then they start going, oh, you Americans, you're like, kind of quit, flighty, change your minds all the time, arrogant, and, they go through the list. And what we did was we went and we discussed each one. And what we realized to really get to the part, because it's not that those comments are wrong. They're just oversimplifications of deeper kind of cultural behaviors, right? And what you find is that, as an example, in German culture, one of the classical kind of ways in which people are taught when they go into the business world of like how to succeed is this phrase that a friend of mine told me, another friend told me, is that, you're told you should do what you say what you do, and don't be late. Right. And then, if you just do those three things, you'll be fine in business, you'll do fine in life. But when you think about that, that is the basis of a lot of that, what I considered to be like what I would get the conservatism of my team members in Germany was that they were just very cautious about saying something that they didn't mean and they hadn't thought through in detail, and then having to change their minds. Changing your mind is very, very like, whereas in America, like we would say, oh, that candidate is fantastic. Let's interview three of them, but that's the one we like. And then we would interview three of them and we'd say, well, actually, I really, that guy, we really like Sally. She was the one that really stood out. And it was viewed as so flaky, because I think because for them, if you shouldn't say up front what you like, let's just go through the process. Whereas for us, I think we're constantly communicating. So there's a tremendous amount of communication in American culture. And some of it is, by definition, 80% of it is going to change over time. So what we did in creating this binational company and then we ended up actually also acquiring a little business in Canada and some other things. What we've done is we've made it very clear that there are the things about the company, and actually the CEO of the company now lives in Switzerland. So it's a really, really multinational company. And what we agreed to was that there were items, what we will call our values and our goals, that were not ever going to change. So those were intransient. Those were solid. And yet how we achieved them was open to constant innovation and debate. And I think that really settled everybody down, because it said, okay, you tell me that I have to go do X. That's great. Now you're going to let me be free to do whatever I want to get to X. And I think that helped everybody get on the same page. And so we took a lot of time being very careful about some of the things that we would say. And then we were very open that some of the other goals we had were by definition not going to work. They were going to change. We were going to fail. We were going to pivot. We were going to do X, Y, Z, because the science is unknown. I mean, you're really on the edge of knowledge in some of these companies. I think that was like one interesting learning. I think that in Asia, like in Hong Kong, I remember, the value
Can
of
I
equity.
pause for before we
Sure.
go to Asia?
Sure.
I was just thinking that it sounded like the decision-making process was different. With Americans, it was more like you were talking, loudly open, what you were thinking. For the Germans, it was like a silent, and then sort of some kind of a conclusion, or you had decided your mind, then you basically start to talk.
And then you do, and when you say you're going to do something, you don't stop till you accomplish it, which also makes you a little bit more conservative, because it's really bad if you can't get something done. Whereas I think in America, quitting is not good, but I think pivoting is okay in some sense. We adjust as we go along.
Quickly
And
adjusting and
quickly
adapting.
adjusting, yeah. And so they're very different, but they're both good, by the way, because some goals and some tasks, you can't pivot. You just got to hang in there and keep pounding away at the thing until you get it done. I think, also in Germany, like in America, I know a number of entrepreneurs who've been unsuccessful a couple of times, and then everybody remembers them for their third or fourth attempt. And, in Germany, you're personally liable, actually, if your company doesn't do well, if you're the CEO. I think the cultural risk is much, much higher. A failure is much, much higher. That's one thing about America, that American entrepreneurship, and I think the Israelis are similar in that sense. As far as I've met, I haven't worked in Israel, but the entrepreneurs I met, failure is not viewed as a bad word. It's just viewed as a piece of data. Like you tried it, it didn't work, okay, and then you tried something else, and you tried until you figured it out. If you're always getting better and smarter and faster, we call it innovation, whereas other cultures call it failure. And I think that is the biggest cultural barrier to entrepreneurship in what I've seen in Europe. I think is that, is that pressure. I think in Asia it's different. I think that I think like in China, they're very entrepreneurial, constantly starting new companies, etc. However, I think that their time scales are really short. And what I noticed is that equity was not something of great interest to people because they had never, like in private companies, they didn't really know how it worked. They didn't really understand. Now, this is 2008, it's a long time ago, but when we started that company. But they were very, very short. The investors in particular, but in general, people there was a very fast pacedness to things. And so if it wasn't going to work fast, it wasn't going to work. Ironically, that group that we created, that became the foundation of a company and a subsidiary of a U.S. business, there was a drug that just had really interesting data that came out of that group's work. So I think there are exceptions. It's not a rule, but I just noticed when I was there that most of the people we were interviewing were kind of in a rush to figure out, like, how's this company going to do? How fast is the value going to go up? I think, in Singapore, people are very interested in good jobs, and I think salaries mean a lot to people, so, and so I think digging deep if you're going to start a company in a new environment, if you're going to invest in a company in a new environment, I think really understand what makes the culture tick. Like for some people, having a stable job isn't just about them. It's about the pressure their wife and their mother and their father and everybody else putting on them and all their friends and everything. So kind of dismissing that and saying, oh, just come to this startup no one's ever heard of before is, you're kind of missing what they're trying to tell you, with their, I think when they're, acting, maybe a little more careful and conservative, like it's not because they don't understand what you're saying. It's just their cultural rules that they've been, that run that, that run that environment, that run that society. And I think understanding them and really being curious about them. So I find it quite interesting, of like digging in. And hierarchy is also another thing, I mean, a lot of cultures are pretty hierarchical. America, a little less so, and then understanding how, like, you would hear grumbling sometimes, right? In certain companies I've started in certain places, people grumble a lot. And I always took that really seriously until people said to me, look, because they have to do what the boss says, it's not like America where you just get to like combat, like challenge management all the time. The only way they get to express themselves is through the grumbling. So the grumbling is a necessary part of the feedback process because they can't say it directly. Once the boss says we're going left, you have to go left. But that grumbling is the only thing that allows them to get some of their ideas out and some of their sense of self and independence for the staff. So you actually want to encourage don't view it's an important piece of the pressure valve. Whereas, you would be arguing with your boss in the hallway. They're not allowed to do that. And I think, again, that's true. Very different cultures, different cultures have very different sense. I mean, if you go to Japan, very, very different hierarchical, how the layers within a company interact with each other is very different than, say, in Israel or in America or Germany, or, so I think just being super sensitive about that stuff if you're going to go into new territory is really important. I think
Uh,
we generally aren't that sensitive. We just go in and and complain that it's not going the way we want it to go. Yeah, it's cool.
yeah, there's a rather recent book, Reed Hastings, about Netflix and Netflix culture and how they were actually becoming international. And they're describing in the book the process of Americans going to different places
Yeah,
and having the same experiences and what is really in the nature of the company
yeah,
and what are the things we achieve and different ways of doing it. And there's some examples of difference between Singapore and Americans.
yeah.
And one of the things I remember from the book is that for Americans, you have to start with something positive, sort of wrap it up nicely, sort of cushion the thing, and then you can actually say the real thing. What do you want to say? And there was some other examples. If you haven't read it, it's an excellent book. Did you notice that when you were working with the Germans and the German company and the US office that they started to sort of become like a hybrid in a way that they started to have, learn from each other, and it became like the culture of its own.
Well, we pushed for that. I mean, we viewed it. There's a kind of a general rule I learned early on that I saw other people do it, and is take your bug and turn it into a feature. If you can't take your limitations, and you see this in sports all the time. Like for example, there's a great documentary actually on a number of like the best athletes in the various sports. And when you interview them, what you realize when they grew up is that they actually were the ones with the deficiencies. So Wayne Gretzky, who's a very famous American hockey player, Canadian, actually, he's a Canadian who played in both the U.S. and Canadian hockey leagues, very famous. And Wayne Gretzky talked about how he was actually pretty small and pretty slow. He's not a very fast skater. It's ironic because he seems so fast on the ice. But that in his own mind, one of the reasons he had to figure out how to predict the game was because he was slower than the kids around him. And the reason he invented, kind of essentially became very proficient at skating behind the net, was because he would get beat up if he did. He couldn't take the hits, consistently over a career if he stayed in the middle. So one of his coaches taught him, like, why don't you just kind of spend your time behind the net? That way you're going to get hit a lot less. And this guy Jerry Rice, who for American football fans is viewed as one of the best, if not the best receiver of all time, and he was unbelievable at like his running routes, and you always thought he was fast. It turns out he was actually quite slow. But what he had to do is he had to work on perfect timing. So his timing was unbelievable, and he kind of invented this whole process of being like perfect precision timing on the passes. And it's because he was slow, because he didn't have a natural athleticism that some of the people around him did. So I think that part of the secret to life is to appreciate your limitations and make the best of them. And so what we did with this company Dewpoint that I was the CEO of was to realize like it's a limitation to have half the team in Germany, half the team in the US. So how do we turn it into a positive? I think it ended up weirdly becoming a pop. So yeah, so we definitely spent a lot of time, thinking about the benefits of the culture. I think the real positive came almost in a more, tactical way, because once the pandemic hit, we had already been working by Zoom for a year. So it was like seamless. I was running the company at the time. And we also had the advantage that we had two different jurisdictions that were going through kind of COVID rules at slightly different times. So our labs could always, it just worked out that we always had a lab that was always up and running, because between the two places we could transfer knowledge. And now that was a result of a decision we made early on, was that we would not put certain functions in certain geographies, but that our chemistry group would be spread out in both geographies. Our biology group would be in both geographies. Our informatics group was actually was being built primarily in the U.S. and Canada, but we would also involve people in Germany. And so, because I didn't want there to be a dividing line that said, "Oh, the biology is done in Boston and the chemistry is done in Dresden," because then that would make the groups split apart. So we wanted to make sure that each scientific discipline of the company or sub discipline of the company had people in both countries, so that it forced a cross culturalism. So, and then the benefit that that created was we essentially had a redundancy. So when the pandemic hit, I don't think we predicted a pandemic, but when the pandemic hit, we had people that did biology in both jurisdictions. We had people that did chemistry in both places. So it was just easy to we had all of our equipment had been, we essentially had twice as much, we had almost not quite the same level or amount, but we had equipment that could be purposed for these functions in both geographies. So it made it super easy during the pandemic to just keep rolling, which I think people were a little surprised by. So it turned out like a really great thing, but it was kind of by accident. But I think we did early on consciously want to build a two country culture. So we forced people to always be interacting with each other. I'll tell you, one of the things that was really hard is time zones. Because time zones are surprisingly, I mean, it seems like such a simple thing, but we especially during the time of the pandemic when, kids were home a lot more, et cetera, we had a lot of issues with, what was kind of 12 o'clock here was now 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock there, by the afternoon. So people here are wanting to get going, and there, they have to feed their kids and stuff. So we started to create like blackout periods, in both geographies where people were expected to kind of not be around actually. And you can, flop back online, once the kids are down or whatever, especially during that period where all families were living together in the house, it became really, really difficult. And we tried to institute, policies where the people with the kids actually were the ones that made, it didn't matter what your hierarchy was. If you had children or family or whatever, you're the one that decided when the meeting would be. So that, we kind of, it never really got to that level, but I think just making sure that people with kids understood that they were on our minds and that we were accommodating whatever they wanted. They never took it, it never got to be overly hard, structured, but I think it just gave them a sense, people with, they tend to be the younger people in the staff, et cetera, gave them a sense that people were completely sensitive to what they were going through. So yeah, it was, I think that period of time was interesting because, I think it forced people, if you had a good company culture, you actually got to learn about each other a lot more because you ended up in each other's business a lot more, so if you, had little kids, it was now like totally cool to tell people I've got little kids, whereas before you don't really tell people like work is work and home is home. But here it's like, yeah, listen, I got a dentist appointment I got to take my little kid to or whatever. And people were cool about it, and I think they just became more accommodating of the real life of a person. I don't know. I just loved that part myself. I didn't find it to be an inconvenience.
I don't think we're going back. I think we just now already in some new way of doing it, and people are starting. Some of obviously love it, but it's always circumstantial that some have better workplace at home, and others need to probably find the quiet and peace elsewhere, or do it at night.
Yeah. And we'll see. I mean, we'll see what happens. I mean, we're still kind of in the thick of it, but from a travel restriction, et cetera, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I think people are more comfortable being willing to conduct business, without having ever met someone before. And that makes it a little easier. I think in the end, we're still social creatures and we'll still want to meet each other. So I don't know that business travel will ever completely go away. And I don't know that the structured environment of the workday will completely disappear because I think people still like kind of being together during the day and having some separation. There's a downside to it too, which is a lot of people are burning out, working too many hours, burning out. And so that's not good either. And I think, so we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
One of the things we've been facing in one of the companies is that we have stuff happening in New Zealand and everything between Europe and then the west coast of US. And finding the all hands where most of the people are at the same time is becoming really hard. And it's almost impossible. And
I don't think it's possible, right?
Well, it's within the some tolerance limits, you can barely do it, but it's really narrow the window you can do something together. And this is a challenge in a way that you have to find ways that how you can have the corporate culture, how you make sure that everyone is included, everybody can contribute, and there's the social aspect of doing stuff, but also that you're not missing out when you're sleeping and the other guys are talking, somewhere else.
Yeah.
And I think that pushes a lot of stuff to the asynchronous communication, doing things in a different way, and sort of being innovative. And at the end of the day, the time zones are not going away if the pandemic is going away.
Yeah.
And that just stays anyway. So that's something we've been now facing more, because obviously you cannot travel and it's hard to do, and we just have to accommodate what is. Do you have any experiences, anything you want to say about when you're doing stuff remotely that you need to over communicate, almost like that you have to do something, emphasize something more in order to keep the level of communication, because you cannot meet people?
Yeah, I think maybe you could answer a question for me, which is like, I don't know if you've been outside of Finland for a long period of time for a phase in your life, and then all of a sudden you run into someone who's Finnish, right? That feeling of familiarity, right? And it's very strong, actually. I mean, it happened. Certainly, I grew up, in a lot of different countries, and then ended up in the U.S. And when I meet people that are Iranian, my background, where I was born, there's just a familiarity. There's a very strong connection. It's partly language. It's maybe more expressions. It's it's cultural. It's food. It's a lot of things. And I think that the communication thing, and this is true in a company regardless of whether you're in 2 time zones or 1, which is, I remember when one of the companies that started, this. I was talking to one of the employees. We were sitting next to. I said, "How's it going?" She said, "Well, it's interesting. The company was growing." And she said, it's starting to become a situation where things are happening that people are telling me about things they've done versus me knowing that they were going to do them, because we're too big now. And it used to be one office. And so anything that was happening, I was on my headphones, but I could hear. But now, and I said, "Well, how are you feeling about that?" She said, "Well, I feel at first a little scared, because it's like you feeling like you're out of the loop. But in the end, I realized it comes down to trust. I just have to trust that people are doing the right thing." So Petri, I think that all those tools like Slack and all that crap, I think that it fundamentally, what it comes down to is, do you have a corporate culture that's unique enough and that's strong enough so that people, and you recruit for people that have a sense of trust about the way they're going to behave. Trust is a general statement, but what it really implies is that I can predict what you're trying to do. So I worked in a bank for a period of time, and you could 100% trust that everyone was going to be untrustworthy. Guaranteed. Like, they were going to look out for themselves. It was all about how much money they made for themselves. They were not going to protect you. And it was very comforting in some sense, because those were the rules, and the rules were codified, and they were implicit. I wouldn't say they were explicit. They were implicit, but you saw it in like 95% of people that worked around you, even when they weren't, no one said it out loud, but you could just tell that's the way they were going to behave. And, if you assumed otherwise, you'd get burned. Right. And that was true. And that culture was interesting, because when we met people from other places from that same company, it felt comfortable, familiar, because they were the same way, so there was and I think that's the trick. It's like meeting family members. Like when you meet family at a wedding that you haven't seen in a long time, or like some uncle's niece or daughter that you'd never met before, there's a comfort, a familiarity. That's because the social imprint of your family, the stories that have been told, the the importances, the traits that the family makes important, he holds as important, are powerful. And I think for a company, defining its culture, recruiting people to that culture, promoting them along the lines of that culture, and being very explicit about it, I think that makes it easier, because then when you find out that the New Zealanders have done something, and made a decision XYZ, if it's consistent with what you assume they were going to do, then you're like, okay, great. And when you meet them, when you finally make the trip over there, it feels like you're meeting people that you understand very well. And there's a comfort factor. I think if you don't put that kind of effort into it, it's very, very hard. I don't think a asynchronous communication tool is going to make up for that. If people aren't, to me, it's all about culture. It's all about company culture. And it's about defining the unique nature of your culture and imprinting it on, like putting it, burning it into back of people's retinas with constant reminders, really getting it burnt in there. Now that culture can be very different. It could be a very flat egalitarian culture. It can be a very what's in it for me kind of culture. I mean, there's no good or bad. There's, every company has its culture. It works or it doesn't. Right. Some of us like to work in one style versus another. I don't think there's I'm not elitist about culture, but I do think that that's probably, to me, what I found. And so in this company in Germany and the US, what was a common thread for everybody was incredible scientific curiosity. So the one thing that there was obviously honesty and transparency. There was the usual kind of things that we wanted. And that's true in a number of good companies. But what really stood out here was people were really, really curious about each other's work and very, very good at criticizing and questioning without making people feel bad. And that you could see it all the time. People just have really good conversations. It's a very conversational company. So when you go there, it's like you can sit in a corner and just talk to someone at length about stuff. And I think that made it very comfortable. So when they got on the Zoom, or when they felt like friends. And so I think that's what has kept the bond of that company with a time zone challenge. It's a little harder with New Zealand, the West Coast, and Europe. I think it's basically impossible, but I don't know how you create that shared culture, but that's probably that's my view of it.
Yeah, that's the question I was about to ask, that can you actually create a culture, or are you actually recruiting the culture?
Well, I think so what I've done, I don't know if it works or not, but I don't know, it's a system I've used, is that once you get to about 8-10 people, maybe certainly by the time you get to 20, you are going to have a culture. Now, the question is, do you want to be the hammer? Or do you want to be the nail? Do you want to let the culture just kind of emerge from the 20 people you hired and how they start to interact with each other to be effective and successful? Or do you want to take those 20 people and say, or 15 or 10 or whatever, and say, okay, what are the things that the group of us, find near and dear and important? And let's put those up on a wall, or, wherever on a screen. And let's narrow it down, because there'll be 100 things that everybody loves, like motherhood and apple pie, right? But can you narrow that down to a set of things that define us, that are the most important for this group of 20 people versus any generic group of 20 people in, say, tech or biotech or whatever. And then start to build the case around the uniqueness of that particular configuration of either words and ideas and goals, and really refine it down and make it unique, right? And I think, to me, that's the trick, because then you can start to build a recruiting process that, I had one company where from the very beginning, everybody said they wanted to work in groups. The idea was that we would create small units that would tackle problems, and versus kind of hierarchical assemblies, a little bit more pods, that you've seen at different places like Google. Or in biotech, it wasn't that common to operate that way, so it was kind of fun to try it. And what we decided was that the recruiting process was therefore never going to be one-on-one at that time. This was when I was CEO. I don't know what happens now, but so every time we would recruit somebody, it was always 2 or 3 of us and the recruit, always in a quasi-public space, kind of a coffee shop or a cafe or the cafeteria or whatever, and always in a conversational way, and that helped solidify the kind of way in which we were going to work in the company and see how this person would interact in that environment. It wasn't a 3 people asking one person a bunch of questions. It was 3 people having a conversation and seeing how the 4th interacted in that conversation. And we have to be careful not to over-index for extroverts and under-index for introverts. And we had to be careful that some people don't necessarily want to express an idea right then, but they want to come back to it. So over time, we figured out how to do the interviewing process in such a way that we took out the artifacts, the mistakes that would come from a particular way of doing things, and were able to select for the right personalities, but that we were able to imprint on people exactly what we were trying to describe as a culture, and people always remembered that. And I think in this other company I was telling you about, the one in the U.S. and Germany, Dewpoint, I've met people who have worked there, not worked there, interviewed, etc. They all remember that everybody has to, which is not uncommon in biotech. People have to give like a talk about the science that they've done in the past. It's kind of called the job talk or whatever, but usually it's a scientific presentation in these science organizations. And what people always talk about is the sheer number of people that would dial in from all over the US and Germany to anyone's talk, and the degree of questions and curiosity for the talk. It was like, that was the thing that like was the centerpiece of the interview process, was just the way in which everybody would get motivated for anyone's talk. And it was both an advertisement for the company as well as a interview of the person to see, like, could they handle that kind of curiosity. But that's what has been the nature of this company, is just broad-based curiosity, right, about stuff. So I think you can do it. I think the interview process is the first place, but it won't. So you have to set your culture, you have to set your promotions, the way in which you give feedback to people, whether it's every 3 months or once a year or whatever, the way in which you promote people or give them bonuses or recognize them to the rest of the organization for their accomplishments. That all has to be consistent with your culture. They have to be doing things that, you have to recognize the things they do that reinforce the culture that you want to see. So I do think just setting the culture and putting words on a board doesn't work. You have to then turn that into, I think it actually starts with your promotion and bonus and reward system and review system. And then it also has to be embedded in your recruiting system. But if you just do recruiting and you don't do the others, then people kind of drift over time. So it's just like this constant process, I think it's cool, but yeah, you have to set a culture, try to make it unique. But if you think about Finnish culture, Persian culture, whatever, a big part of it is also the stories. I think stories and so I don't know that like Slack to me is like the strongest way to share something, because it's like disconnected, like, sure. But I think stories, recognition, like, I don't know. I think those are more interesting. One of the first inventions mankind made was stories, right? On the cave drawings on the cave walls and stuff. They told stories. Stories are very old. Gilgamesh, I think, is the first story, but I may be wrong on that. But certainly, I think for Western civilization, story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu is one of the first ones. But these are very, very old things. I think they predated agriculture, maybe, but and they're really important for passing down information and traits and knowledge that you want to pass down, right? So I don't know. I'm probably more of a story guy than I am a internet solution to than a tech solution, like a Python based solution set, where
So
it's like either an app
brings
or
me
a
an
Slack.
idea. There's no, in some company, there may not be a corporate culture, manual or book. There's just a storybook.
Yeah.
Let me tell a story. Once upon a time, there was a, founder, blah, blah, and, then you go on and.
Yeah. Well, we had actually, one of my companies did that. So this company, Jnana, which was when I was involved in, and I was the CEO for about a year and change prior to starting Dewpoint. Um, we we came up with this idea. It's called the Book of Jnana, and each people were encouraged. I wrote when I wrote the kind of guiding document for the company, the guiding premise, like white paper for the company. We made that book one, chapter one of the book, and I don't know if they've continued it, but I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, is like to have a scrapbook or something. I mean, anything that kind of describes the stories of, and think about it, that's your family. I mean, around, you're talking about old Uncle Henrik that, showed up, here or there, and, I don't know, like, had to sleep for 2 nights in the snow because he forgot his keys to his car, whatever it is. Like, it's the stories and it's that set of stories. Each of them has a feature of your family culture that your family find. I mean, it's a story that people like to tell each other because it highlights something that people want to highlight, and that becomes, kind of imprinted on the rest of your family.
And that's basically coming back to the relationships.
Yeah.
They are embedded with stories, because what is a relationship without a story? So because we've been now talking so much stories, you were in some conference, I bet it was boring or not, but you met someone who was familiar from your past. How did you met Rodney Mullen? Can you tell the story?
And that's how you and I got to know each other, was through Rodney. Well, it was strange. I was at this neuroscience conference in Massachusetts, so it was easy for me to go to it. And there was this gentleman who was kind of didn't had a slightly different kind of carry and bearing a little bit, and was kind of sitting by himself in the hallway, kind of peripheral. Like, not, some people would go to conference and they sit like in the front table, and, this is not Rodney. And so there's this gentleman, and I remember thinking, man, that person looks familiar to me. I don't know why, but they don't, there's a reason I know that person, but I don't know why I know that person. I couldn't
was like thinking, just maybe it's from TV or
yeah, or something. And then I'd watched a number of documentaries, and also, he looks a little different than we were growing up, but he was quite a big figure in my life as a terrible skater. It's going to be embarrassing, actually, if we all ever end up skating together, because I'm a terrible, terrible skater. But I loved it a lot, and I remember, but he's a little older now, so his look has changed. But I was like, yeah, there's something familiar about that. And then I was looking through the conference program, and I saw, I'm like, that name, like, that's a skater. What's he doing? Is that the same person? And then I Googled him, and and I realized that's him. So I went up to him and I said, are you? I don't want to, I don't want to be rude, but are you Rodney Mullen? And he goes, yeah. Oh, cool, man. Like, it's like great to see you. And I think I was like the only person that kind of recognized him, and then we just started chatting about, just the conference and stuff, and part of it also is that I grew up quite a few hours of my day each day as a child until I was about 14 or 15. I was skating. So there's quite a lot of skate culture that you also absorb during, the 8 years or whatever I was kind of skating around. And so that, there's some mannerisms and some behavior that become familiar to each other. And it, again, for him, it's a comfort, right? Because here he is in this environment that, isn't one he's completely comfortable with. And I, the same, it would be true for me. Like, if I went to an environment that was all pro skaters, I wouldn't feel so great about myself. But being around someone like him, who has a great curiosity for mathematics and for other things, make you feel comfortable. Like, okay, I'm not completely I'm not like completely the oddball here. And I think that, yeah, it's, but like I said, I've always had this curiosity for people that I've just been very curious about people. So if I meet someone and they look like they have an interesting story to tell me, I just go over there. And just try to talk to them and chat about stuff and just be super curious about stuff. So yeah, I don't know. That's how we met. And then we became friends. I mean, that was like 4 years ago, I think. And quite a lot of good has come from it, different interactions of our curiosities and interests. Yeah, it's been fun. Yeah.
And then you shared some stuff as also with MIT. I think you were helping to launch the MIT Sandbox Innovation Fund as well. And
I did. Yeah, my partner Alan Spoon and I essentially started that, architected it for um, the at the time the chancellor for student affairs, Chancellor Grimson, I believe. He had come to us and we'd had breakfast one day, and my partner Alan was a very proud alum of MIT. I went there in grad school, so the undergrads tend to think of the grad school ones as like like second, we're not quite undergrads. We're like, we're MIT associated versus MIT. But nonetheless, I spent a lot of years there, and so we had gone to breakfast with the chancellor, and he had described this problem they were having, which is that, in general, they're always trying to make the campus more of a engaging and fruitful place for the students, and especially the undergraduates. And the average age at which people have started their first company has been going down. So MIT has always had a lot of entrepreneurs, but when they do these surveys, like what was the age at which you started your first company, for a long time it was in their 40s. Typically what would happen is people would go and work at like GE or Westinghouse or IBM or whatever, and then at some point they were like, I can make a better server, or I can make a better engine or pump, and then they would leave to go start their own company. But what was happening was that the average age was dropping dramatically, to the point where now, like, entering kids that were coming in from high school wanted to start companies. And so what we created for MIT, but it was really interesting, so I remember, when I was a student there, if you wanted to study, if you wanted to study mathematics, but you were also a very good swimmer, and I played water polo, so I played with a lot of the water polo kids. I was in the pool a lot with the swimmers. And so, these are kids that, would go off and, study whatever subject they wanted. But because they had a passion for a particular athletic activity, the student body, the faculty, everybody appreciated that they were putting in extra effort to go swim, let's say in the Division III championships or whatever, whatever level, if they had a swim meet or they had a competition or whatever, and that they were representing MIT, and they would be proud of that. So they would shift midterms for them. There were accommodations that were made to accommodate the fact that this person was living essentially a double life that was generally good for the campus. On the other hand, if you have a startup, you don't have that benefit, right? Because you have to do everything at night. If you launch a website for XYZ, let's say to connect people on campus who may want to chat with someone about something, all of a sudden that website takes off. All of a sudden, you have like 20,000 new members, and you're thinking, if you got midterms next week, you have midterms next week. They're not, no, you can't, you had to hide it. You had to hide it, from everybody. And there was no way to be proud of it, although technically you should be very proud of this, and the campus should be very proud of you. So we created this sandbox program where a number of investors put in money, and we actually created something kind of interesting, which I'll talk to you about on that. But basic idea was investors would put in money and create a fund on campus, and that fund would then be essentially almost like a drawdown account for students who wanted to start their companies. Now they would have to propose a business, and there's a whole selection process, et cetera. So it would make it somewhat VC-like, but in the end, the selection isn't about finding, like, there's business plan competitions and things. But if you think about a business plan competition, it's to get 1,000 kids to submit something so like 2 or 3 win some money. That's a prize. That's not, this is an education system. So if, Petri, you have an idea and you're a young student, the most important thing we can do is give you a little bit of money to figure out, do you like trying an idea, or are you just better off not being an entrepreneur? Like, the single best piece of advice you can get as a young person is, do you like that process of getting negative feedback, or do you prefer not to, do you not like that process? And because so many people think they should be entrepreneurs, and then a lot of people don't really think they're suited for it or whatever, and then they try and they love it. And so it's really like math. Like, when you go to a university, you should try math, and, half the kids are going to like it, and half the kids should drop out and say, I don't really like math. I'm going to go back to chemistry or physics or, English or whatnot, literature. And so I think we'd set it up so that the amounts of dollars were small, the volume of students was high, so they became viewed more as a process for you to self-discovery versus, ooh, like I'm going to win and, all that. And so that ended up being very, very successful. At this point, I think within a year or two, I think we had it was offered to every single freshman that came on campus when they would get the letter that they'd been accepted to MIT. They would say, and by the way, we have money set aside for you in case you have a company you want to try.
Wow.
So it became embedded within the architecture of the university. But when we launched it, I went around campus, I had to convince all these professors with my partner Alan and the dean of engineering at the time, Ian Waits, who was the big internal champion for it. We would meet professors all over, and people would say to us, well, it's going to distract the kids. The kids aren't really interested in this. Entrepreneur, it was just a lot of negative energy, which, is fine. It's a new idea. But once we tried it, everybody kind of got on board and said, wow, this is like the fabric. Now, the thing we invented, which I thought was kind of cool, is that when I would go on campus and give talks, I always had this issue, after the talk, people come up to you and tell you like some idea they're working on. And if they're a student, I was always feeling like if the idea was terrible, I actually felt fine because I would just tell them, like, I think, for XYZ reason, this is a terrible idea. But if the idea is good, you're always a little bit worried because what if you tell this kid, yeah, that's a great idea, and then they drop out of school, and now like, say 18-year-old, 19-year-old, like they drop out of school, they don't get a degree, the idea does or doesn't work, I don't know, but like, I always felt conflicted that you could have like a bad effect on someone's life. And Sandbox kind of solved that because it allowed kids to stay on school, being in class, extending their calendar years sometimes, changing their academic schedules so that they could accommodate these ideas. So it allowed for that. And what we did was we put in place this idea that the investors in the fund had a fiduciary responsibility to the student. When I invest in a company and I get shares, I have a fiduciary responsibility to all shareholders, right, as a board member. So I have to give the CEO advice and or make, vote in such a fashion. But, what you're investing in here, quote unquote, as an investor in Sandbox, as a participant, as a financial participant in Sandbox, you're investing in a kid. And when you give him advice, you better be thinking about the kid, not about your money and not about anything else. And we had it as a loose statement that you had a fiduciary responsibility to the student, but we had it very clear that if you ever broke that responsibility, you get kicked off campus and you'd never, like MIT, people would be pretty upset about it. And you'd get kicked out of the program. And lo and behold, that program now has quite a lot of investors in it. It is a key part of the best company ideas. I mean, it's basically where all the startups at MIT happen because the kids can get the money so cheap and so easy. So investors in those funds have an advantage because they can see stuff a little earlier, but they also just get to meet the students and mentor them and be around them. So it turned out to be quite a good, it was cool. It worked out. It could have been a disaster too, but luckily it didn't. Yeah. But yeah, and some other universities have followed suit. Like Harvard now has a similar program, and I think Duke launched a similar. I forget, Cornell maybe. MIT was approached by a bunch of schools trying to try the same thing out.
So how do you see the future? What's changing in this decade in VC funding, startups, even biotech? What's exciting? What are you sort of your concerns? How do you see
it's
the
a good question. I mean, we're living at a time of cheap money, which is good because it makes innovation a lot easier, right? Because when money is cheap,
is it cheap, or is it just there's been a bit more money printing and it just
that makes it cheap?
Seems to maybe your fund is a bit bigger, so it's cheap for you now. You've been so successful.
Well, it's just easier to get because the government's pumping it. People can't. Normally people would put it in a savings account and save it, or get a bond or whatever, but they can't, right? Because the government has made in almost every major country those ways of like saving your money or creating returns are basically gone now. So the only way you can do it is put it in equities. And once the stock markets get, there's a defined size of a stock market, a public stock market. Once that gets too expensive, and then people turn to the private market. So for for an entrepreneur, this is the best time ever to raise money. I think that's true in almost every market. Valuations are up. I think that that is good, right? Because it gets people to try hundreds and hundreds of ideas that otherwise, when money is scarce, only 5 or 6 of those ideas get tried. I do think that competition is very high now because of that. There's a lot more Me Too and copycatting that's happening. I think that I think that as a consequence, a small sliver of these companies will end up being successful because there's so much extra stuff being generated. Probably what I worry the most about is in my world, which is biotech, is just the amount of it takes us probably a decade to train someone properly to be a good biotech scientist, because it takes usually 6 or so years of graduate school training and then another 3 4 years of like being on the job and doing well and stuff, and then ultimately like you're kind of or your career is kind of moving and maybe you're not quite a mid-level manager but you're getting there. But the salaries are, because of that supply chain problem, all of a sudden in the last 2 years or 3 years the number of companies exploded. And I think in tech, you had a similar thing happen where the war for talent became very hard. But you had an ability to be virtual. So you had countries like India and Israel and other places contributing huge amounts of talent to the global talent pool. And so companies in San Francisco were able to continue to like do well because of that. That's biotech is a little harder to do that because the work has to be done physical, next to each other. So that mobility is difficult, and at the end of the day, there aren't that many people studying biotech all over the world. I mean, the U.S. is the dominant place. You didn't have like what IIT did in India and what the Israeli military did in Israel for building tech talent. I think it's just taking a lot longer in biotech. So I think in the life sciences, you're seeing a lot of more companies and people being, there's and I worry that the quality of some of these products may ultimately suffer. We may have product failures. These companies may not do well because people just were put in positions of a little, we're kind of, the companies kind of grew too fast, grew too many people, didn't have the experience that's required. And in our world, biotech, especially biotech that meets medicines, that aim to become medicines, if I make a bad decision today, like in tech, if I'm coding something or whatever, I mean, occasionally these problems can be downstream, but usually you find out in 6 months that the product had a bug or a flaw or whatever. Our projects take 10 years. So you will find out 8 years from now that someone made a bad decision 8 years ago or 3 years ago or whatever. And it's very costly. And so you don't get the feedback loops that you have in other industries. And I think especially when it comes to manufacturing, it's a problem everyone's having. Like we just can't find enough good manufacturing people, good regulatory people, good number of people, disciplines. And it's just because everybody expanded, but the talent pool doesn't grow as fast. And yeah. And so I think the same thing is happening in Germany right now in the construction industry. Like it just takes a long time to train a good carpenter because of the qualification process, et cetera. But people want to build houses now, so there's a long wait list. And yeah, so I think that's kind of what's happening in my world is like there's a lot of salary inflation, real estate prices are way high for rent and everything. And at some point, something's got to give. I don't know what it'll be, but something's going to have to snap things back into place.
What are the exciting stuff happening in this decade in biotech? You're in the field, so it's obvious to you, but I'm not so familiar with the biotech, and I bet a lot of the listeners it's the same. If you're coming more from the tech side, we're probably more familiar with AI, ML, and AR, and these type of things. But
Yeah.
what comes to biotech, what are the exciting fields, and we start to see them coming to the consumers as well?
Well, I think the big revolution has been the ability to, with increasing levels of precision, change the code, the DNA, and alter and modify the DNA of something, whether that something is a patient that may have cancer or could have cancer in the future, whether that's like a virus or a mosquito that you're trying to change so it doesn't carry a virus, or whether that's like a cell in a dish or in a manufacturing facility that would produce some chemical that you're interested in. I think just the ability to do kind of precision engineering on biological systems, it's an area, it's been somewhat separate because people call it synthetic biology if you're not dealing with humans or animals and things like that. And then they call it kind of agricultural biotech if you're dealing with plants and humans, and animals. And they call it like biotech if you're dealing with humans. But fundamental to all of those is that, you're doing essentially precision engineering on the code. And just over time, it's the tools for doing that precise engineering gotten better. It used to be, you'd maybe put a whole gene in, or, it used to be you would just like do empirical work and hope, you would breed a bunch of things together and hope for the outlier. Then, people got to genetic engineering, but now you're doing a lot of, very precise abilities to change information inside the DNA code. At the same time, probably relatedly, that you have, so the tools are getting better, but the data is going up because you have so much more genetic monitoring. So all the look at the COVID thing, the sheer number of nucleic acids that were measured around the globe and are measured every day now to see if this virus, someone is infected with a virus, is massive. Like that wasn't happening 2 years ago. Now, but people were doing a lot more genetic testing and stuff, but it just took it just exploded. So I think that the combination of being able to test cheaper and cheaper and being able to change anything you don't like is just going to be profound. At some point it's going to run into the ethical considerations, of humans. And, do we want to look, at the end of the day, if you put a map up, I did this once at a talk I gave at MIT. I put on a screen, in one shot, like all the organisms that humans have genetically engineered. It's basically everything but humans. It's like dogs, cats, like you name it. We've genetically engineered them. Bananas, there's basically been we have no shame in modifying anything. But the one thing we have decided not to modify is ourselves out of some ethical, some concept of ethics. Now, there's a lot of people that are pissed off that we're modifying everything else around us because, they would argue that's not very ethical. And then, there is this force of people who, will increasingly want to modify ourselves. It'll start as medicine, but it'll probably progress beyond that. So I don't know. I think, I think the ethical considerations of the ability to modify the environment around us and kind of create a designer environment and that's becoming increasingly in our control, whereas before it wasn't really in our control. Like we could pick bamboo. Like if I wanted bamboo in my backyard, I could get someone to get me bamboo from China and bring it here. But now I can create like fluorescent bamboo, that, I can do whatever the heck I want, and now it becomes like I get to create, not, again, I'm being a little bit futuristic, but theoretically I should just like be able to modify my environment. So it's a version of the AR VR thing, except in the living world. So I don't know. So my guess is actually it'd be interesting. I hadn't thought about it before. Whether are there ethical dilemmas and questions and futurists wondering about where all that stuff goes. And since we're kind of talking about the same thing here, which is you get to live in a disconnected reality because you get to engineer your reality right now in the more physical world, the biological world, rather versus a digital world. Do you have the same problems,
I think we're sort of approaching the consciousness question quite, deeply. Coming from the AI world, it's like a generic, AI. Then there's also the quantum physics. We're coming to the point as well, that's been already happening for the last 100 years or so. And then it's like, what is a human? Is it my part? Where is the human part? When I'm a human, when I'm not a human, is the obviously the philosophical question in a way. What is a house? Is it the windows? Is it the floor? When it becomes a house, where is the person? Where are the limits? How much can be adjusted or modified, and what are the proper ways to do that? And I think we sort of coming to these questions whether we want or not, but it's just happening.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think we're pushing the limits. It'll be interesting to see how, it's going to be a complicated world for our kids. That's for sure.
What is your favorite word?
Oh, my favorite word. I don't know, hope, I guess. I don't know. I kind of like hope.
What is your least favorite word?
Quit, I guess. I just don't like quitting.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
I think other humans, I think we've touched on that. Like, I find humans fascinating.
What turns you off?
Humans, I think, I think there's certainly a lot of
I
cases
think there
where
was a
humans,
French philosopher who was sort of, giving that phrase as well.
yeah. I think, I think probably the same. Certain humans definitely turn me off. It would get me pretty depressed.
Yeah, every man it's probably, thinks that sometimes, other
Yeah.
people are the hell.
Yeah.
What's your favorite curse word?
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm a big fan of fuck. Like, I think so to be fair, I love it. It's a great word. I use it all the time. My kids are always yelling at me. We have a swear jar. We have a menu system in our house where, depending on how bad the word is that I use, it's always me that use bad words. But if for those of your listeners that are from Mexico, the Mexicans have a word for, I don't know, like the same bad word, the F word, but there's a whole philosophy around it. Like it can be a place. Like, it's really weird. It's like you can say to people like, this is going to sound terrible. I mean, I'm not supposed to say this online, but like "vete a la chingada."
This is for
for
adults.
people,
So,
for adults.
if you
Yeah.
intend, you can do it.
So like they just use the word chingar or chinga is like, there's just different versions of how they use it. That's like so much more sophisticated than the American. So I love it. Yeah. Yeah. So, props to all the Mexican listeners out there. That's just an awesome culture around the word chingar.
What sound or noise do you love?
It's interesting, and some of your listeners, may relate to this, is that and I know that there's only a period of time in my life. So I would say waves has generally been my thing, like just the sound of like waves breaking. But more and more, what I know is fleeting is what I call the sound of a house waking up, because I have kids and that never used to be a sound I knew about. And then as my kids have gotten older and they wake up and you can hear them go downstairs and, start to kind of like, you hear things like opening and closing, and it's like a house awakening, and, in a few years that sound will be gone too. Right. So I would say that, I don't know if it's a sound specifically, but the sound of a house kind of coming to life is like, to me, awesome. Cheers me up whenever I hear it. Now, I myself don't like to get out of bed, so I'm like, but everybody else seems to. I don't know. I just love the sound.
What sound or noise do you hate?
I don't know. I mean, I think scratchy things, kind of like very high pitched, like screams, kind of bum me out. But I don't know. I'm not super. As people in my family would confirm, I'm not very good with sounds and like pitch and noise. So I would say, yeah.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
To attempt. Well, I think when you go through so many years of schooling, you always have this kind of fascination with being a professor. I was lucky to realize that I'd be very bad at it. So, but in the back of my head, there's always like this, wow, it'd be great to be a professor, because it seems to have all these benefits, which I'm not sure about. Probably, I think more than anything, right now, I get a lot of comfort working, kind of like around a property, like, farming, just a physical labor of being around livestock and, and like trees and like plants and stuff. And, I don't know if it would be super fun, like if that's all I did, but certainly as like my major distraction, that's probably my main distraction right now. I don't know if that's a profession that I would do if I didn't do this, but it's certainly like the hobby. It's definitely the thing I'm dreaming about doing if I ever stop doing this. And part of it is, it has a lot less, bad, humans that bum you out, trees are pretty cool. Like they don't mess around too much.
So what profession would you not like to do?
Would I not like to do?
Yeah.
I mean, I interacted with, I was in banking as an intern for 6 months, and it just wasn't for me. And I think part of it's just going to sound really ironic to everybody that's listening. I don't really, I'm not motivated by money, actually. Like, I got into this business because I was going to work at the company, and the company was doing something really interesting. And then I ended up working on another project that was doing something interesting. We started a beauty company because I thought it was really interesting. We started an energy company because I thought the problem we were trying to solve was really interesting. I guess maybe to be fair, I'm still an engineer at heart. I like to fix things. Like engineers are like kind of built around fixing things, which is why maybe I get bored being, a farmer for too long. But I think that for me, banking just didn't have that. It didn't have a problem you were solving. You were just kind of like shuffling money back and forth for the creation of more money. It kind of bummed me out. I think
Yeah,
there's
it has a different
others.
meaning if you say you're fixing the interest rate.
Yeah, exactly. We would claim that we were fixing clients' problems, and in some cases we were definitely. But a doctor in many cases, like they're of service. You're sick. Whatever. They're trying to fix something. Yeah, it's true. They have other complexities. They've got a big student loan they've got to pay off. Their wife wants, so yes, like there's some abuses in the American system. But broadly speaking, if you're sick, and certainly around the world, we've noticed this, like, the medical profession stepped up to the plate. They stepped up to the plate and saved all our butts, the last 2 years. I don't know. Have you had a banking crisis where all of a sudden a bunch of bankers like stepped up to the plate and like saved us all from like some bank? No, actually never. They're running the other direction. Like, so I don't know. It's not for me. It makes other people happy. It's just not for me.
If you could be a co-founder of any startup in any era, which one would you choose?
Yeah, you asked me that question, I think, when we were first talking about this, when I saw the list. Oh, man, that's a tricky one. I would say that I still don't have a good answer for you, because I think that there are so many companies that have kind of changed. See, I consider technology to be magic, right? In the sense that, like, you think, you don't think humans can fly, and then you see an airplane, you're like, oh my God, humans can fly. Like the first time like I used an iPhone, I was like, how do they figure out like where the pizza place, it was stuff that wasn't possible before and suddenly became possible. I think that, I think that it would be fun to have seen what it was like. I think probably like Bell, it's not so much being a founder, but I think being at a place like Bell Labs would have been really interesting. I think being at, essentially General Electric when Thomas Edison was there would have been just like really interesting, because, it was a time of like solving a lot of problems. I think that if you look at I think Apple is a really interesting company, as is Google, because they do dabble in so many different things, and so I don't know, I think it would be just really fun company, to have been at the front end of a company that shaped a whole industry. And I think I can't think of like one company like that. I think, unfortunately, there's quite a few of them, and increasingly with more and more speed, So yeah, I think it would have been fun. I remember one time, and the humility of some of the people involved in these efforts is like unbelievable. I remember I was at a meeting once with Peter Crisp. So Peter Crisp was a partner at Venrock, and incredible, one of the first partners of Venrock, an incredible gentleman,
And one
like
of
the
the
nicest
first
guy.
VC companies in the world, more or less.
Yeah, very early, very, very early, and nicest guy too, just a gentleman, And I remember I was at this meeting with him. There was 20 of us, maybe 30, and everyone is sitting there on their iPhones. Everybody had an iPhone at that point. And here's the guy that wrote the first check to Steve Jobs. Like, he's there. He's got his own iPhone too, but he's just watching everybody. He never had to say, you wouldn't have known it. Like, he never had to like say, hey, I'm the one that did it or whatever. It was just like amazing to me that it was, obviously Jobs and Wozniak and those guys were the ones that created that company, but But he had a pretty important part in that. Like he gave, I'm sure he had a lot of interesting discussions with them, and you would never have known it. And the nicest man in the world, humble, thanking me for inviting him to this gathering. Oh, it's so nice. I'm thinking, like, what are you talking about, man? Like every single one of us is using a product that you bankrolled. So I don't know. I think it would have been, it would have been fun to have been at Microsoft and Apple just because of the sheer dysfunction of those early companies, like the chaos, like that would have been fun too, I don't know. I think they were all cool. I like all startups, because they're just like very, very entertaining to be there in the early days. But probably, I think working with Edison would have been. It would have been interesting to see like what that was like.
Yeah, there was so much stuff happening at that turn of the century there, and it was quite revolutionary thing in a way that hasn't happened before. We've been now having electricity for a long time. Well, internet didn't happen, but some of these things are like happening here for the first time as well.
I think Netscape would have been good too, because I think that would have been a fun place to work early on too.
Any final words to the audience?
No, I mean, I guess, your audience is, it sounds like mostly entrepreneurs. I just think that, people, it's a tough life, but it's a fun life. It's very rewarding. And, thank you, I guess, to everybody that's listening for keep trying at it. It won't always feel great, but when it does, it's amazing. And I think fundamentally the world is better because of all the efforts, not all the achievements. Because the achievements, okay, that's easy, but it's actually all the efforts that create all the achievements, because the efforts as a whole, you wouldn't get the achievements if you didn't have everybody trying, right? And a subset are going to work, but not if everybody's not trying simultaneously to push on this thing. And so whether it's better energy solutions or better medicines or better tech, products, better, ways of, growing things and, whatever. I just think everybody needs to be pushing on all that stuff to make the world better. And the world is getting better. I mean, it's getting worse too in some ways, but it's certainly everyone wants to make a better world. And more than ever, I think in history, people are like really thinking about the planet and trying to make it better, which is amazing.
Thank you, Amir. It's always such a pleasure and privilege to talk with you. I think I would at least, would go on for hours.
Yeah, no, this is fun. Thank you, Petri. Really appreciate the questions.
And just before we go, I just want to remind our listeners that if you've been listening to this episode, you can also go to YouTube and check it out. A few of the latest episodes are also as a video format. Thanks for joining, and until next time.